tell that you are
Recording.
we can tell that you are very interested in research on China, but why choose to study the BRI, and more particularly, what is the focus on peace and security implications about?
Okay, first of all, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be on the show, and glad to see we made it work in the end. So when we started designing the project, which I'm currently running on the BRI's impact on conflict societies, we had basically identified a research gap. At least back at the time, most of the research on the BRI that you would find took a very top-down perspective. So a lot of it was through a lens of geopolitics about how Chinese influence is spreading throughout the world. And we thought that there was actually very little research in the more local effects which the BRI had. So the specific impact that, for example, building a bridge in a contested area has on the local community. And so we kind of thought it would be interesting to look at this and to look specifically at how Chinese investments are reshaping conflict societies, because that's another aspect of the BRI that I believe is quite specific, that a lot of its investments are clustered in highly fragile and conflict-affected states, so very high-risk environments. And this is kind of a niche which China has carved out for itself under the BRI. And we basically wanted to see how that impacts these local societies. And due to the pandemic, unfortunately, we had to make do with some less than ideal research methods. So we have not yet been able to conduct field research, but we were fortunately able to rely on a network of experts and collaborators who are already present in a couple of these countries, and to also gather their perspectives through teleconferences. And this research has basically resulted in the report that we linked above. So if there's anybody who's interested in how, for example, we believe that the BRI is influencing countries like Pakistan or Myanmar, that's where you can find the preliminary research. And of course, I'd be happy for any feedback from maybe people who live in other countries and would like to contribute their perspective on how the BRI is influencing their home countries.
Right, right. And we can see this sort of set of mixed reaction from the recipient countries who receive this investment from China. Some countries welcome it and some are still concerned. So can you share your experience from researching the interest and reaction of the Western countries?
Mm-hmm. So when you look at Western countries, first of all, I would split that into two different groups again. I mean, on the one hand, you have the United States. The US, I believe, is strongly and fundamentally opposed to the BRI on principle. So the American perspective is largely of the BRI as a tool to spread Chinese geopolitical influence. And they believe that this is basically a zero-sum game. So whenever Chinese influence goes up anywhere in the world, American influence goes down. And from that perspective, of course, there's basically no perspective for any sort of cooperation. In Europe, the perspective is slightly different. I mean, you have some states, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, that have formally joined the BRI. Also, at least one major Western European economy in Italy. And then you have a bunch of states that have so far not joined, but also not strongly condemned the BRI, under which I would also count, for example, Germany. So this is just within this, group of developed Western nations, you already have major divisions. And then, of course, things get a lot more complicated still. If you look at the bulk of countries that have otherwise joined the BRI, which are mostly developing countries from Asia, Africa, nowadays also Latin America, and where the reactions to the BRI often, I mean, you can't really talk about like a national level reaction to it, because the reactions to it are still different among the subnational groups. And I believe this pattern is especially pronounced in conflict societies as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. So that is the reaction from the EU country. But what about the state that you have mentioned, the conflicting states? We've seen Pakistan and Sri Lanka as well. They also receive the investment from China. But we can also see like a shared sentiment emerging from these stages, from the states, that there's a potential lead to the debt trap diplomacy. So what can be the positive and negative influences of the infrastructure investment in these conflicting states, apart from the debt trap diplomacy?
Mm-hmm. So the Belt and Road Initiative in general is trying to fill a gap which the Chinese identified, which is that in developing economies, you have a very pronounced shortfall in infrastructure investments. So they basically don't have the infrastructure which they would need to continue economic development. And this is something which the BRI is especially designed to tackle. So the BRI is supposed to meet an infrastructure demand in countries where previous infrastructure donors and funders have not yet filled it. And there's often a good reason for it, and that is because these are high-risk environments. So infrastructure has a very, very long time horizon until it starts paying off. So you need to be reasonably sure that the country is going to remain stable for at least 10, 20 years. And in conflict states, you don't really have that security. I mean, conflicts could break out again at any moment, and then infrastructure is often one of the earliest targets. So this is like a specific niche which the BRI is targeting. However, within these states, when you look at the projects that are actually being built, they often serve so-called national level development plans that were drawn up by the central government. And especially in countries where the central government does not have a great governance record, does not adequately represent all groups of society. It is often very questionable if this so-called national plan actually serves the interests of their constituents. And this is why you often have a kind of a split pattern in that the central government is very friendly towards China. They're big fans of the BRI. They see it as an option to basically realize visions of development which they've had on the shelf for a long time, and now they finally have the money to actually put them into practice. And then you have local communities often clustered in regions that are not adequately represented at the national level, that take a very different view, that often see it as not serving their own interests, that maybe apart from not getting benefits, they actually have to bear the costs of some of these projects.
Right.
Like, for example, you have a power station that creates local pollution, but does not actually deliver electricity to the local grid. And then this is, I believe, the root cause of a lot of this kind of bottom-up resistance that you see to the BRI. So there's the kind of top-down resistance that comes from geopolitical contentions, but there's also more localized resistance, and that is, I believe, motivated by these concerns.
Interesting. Can you share a little bit more about the local factors that may affect the project or the implementation of these investments?
Sure. So if you take the case which I'm most familiar with, which is Pakistan, the current implementation of the BRI in Pakistan, this China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is by far the largest clustering of BRI investments in the entire world, estimated to cost upwards of 60 billion US dollars eventually, is mainly relying on plans that were drawn up by one of the previous governments of Pakistan, which was a military dictatorship of General Musharraf about 20 years ago. And then these were adapted by yet another government, the government that you had up until 2015, which basically negotiated the outcomes of CPEC that you see on the ground right now. And where there was a very strong pattern that projects were kind of directed into the constituencies to which this party owes its power. So Pakistan is a democracy nowadays, but the voting bloc, which the current party was then serving, is strongly based in just one region of the country, which is Punjab. And other regions within Pakistan had kind of the impression that, okay, this is a Punjabi dominated government that is negotiating with the Chinese and drawing up projects that are located in Punjab. And the rest of the country doesn't get much of it. Or where such projects actually materialize in other places, like Gwadar, for example, this big port that's being built, that's in Balochistan. These are projects on which the local government has next to no influence. They don't get much of the revenues. They don't have much of a say in how the harbor is being built. So it's basically like a localized initiative that is done by Pakistan's central government and China that is materializing in a place where locals themselves have no say in the implementation. And that is, if you look again at the specific case of Pakistan, something which has in that case actually triggered violent resistance against the BRI in the form of repeated terror attacks against Chinese engineering and construction crews.
Okay. So that is one of the things I think is quite alarming in those states. So given that drive for changes, do you think that the BRI can change their approach or the implementation to better meet the local expectation?
That's actually what we're trying to convince most of all the Chinese side of, that would be a worthwhile undertaking. And the approach which we're basically taking for that is twofold. So on one level, we're trying to work with Chinese companies. Mm-hmm. So the companies that are actually building the BRI in local environments. And we try to convince them of using a more, let's say, stakeholder-oriented approach to engage with local communities, to convince them either that whatever project they're building is delivering local benefits, or if that is not actually the case, if the benefits don't materialize locally, that there's a need for side payments. Mainly in the form of corporate social responsibility. So then you need to deliver something else to those groups to make them at least feel that the whole thing is worthwhile for them. Like, for example, in Gwadar, the Chinese engineers that are building the harbor have also built a school, so that they're kind of trying to invest in education. Because that was a big local concern, that locals would not actually get jobs in the finished harbor because they don't have the educational background that's required for it. And these kinds of investments can kind of contribute to plugging that gap. On the other hand, we're also trying, and this is a much more difficult thing, to convince Chinese regulators, so the Chinese state agencies that are actually have to greenlight BRI investments before any work can actually start, that it would be worthwhile to put more of an emphasis on making conflict risks part of their calculations. So that before they approve a project in a very fragile environment, they should think about what kind of effect is this going to have on local conflicts. May this, is this at least, a do no harm thing, or is it actually going to exacerbate local grievances and then maybe also local conflicts? So as you can imagine, that's a much more difficult thing. And I have to admit that we haven't had much success with that yet. But what we're overall trying to do is to convince Chinese actors that this is ultimately in their best long-term interest. If you have a BRI that is actually being approved by the people in whose vicinity the projects are being built, it makes it far more likely that these projects will succeed in the long run, and that it is also going to be better for your bottom line, that you're just not going to lose as much money as you would otherwise.
So that is the recommendation for the BRI, and more about for the Chinese government and corporation. But what about the recommendation for the countries that receive the investment as well? How can they optimize China's investment and avoid the possible debt trap, in your opinion?
So when we're talking about debt trap, first of all, I think this is a bit of a misguided narrative that we're having at the moment. So this assumption of debt trap diplomacy is basically that China is kind of a predatory lender. So that China is willfully extending loans to countries that it knows these countries can't repay, and then using an inevitable default to take control of assets on the ground and to also gain political influence. I don't think that's the case. I don't believe we can explain. I mean, there is a very high failure rate of BRI loans, but I don't think this is the explanation for it. Far more often, the problem is simply at the level of governance in the recipient countries. So that you have governance structures that are not adequately capable of handling investments of this scope. It's very often a very pronounced problem of corruption. There's also the problem that again, especially in conflict states, the central government does not enjoy large levels of trust in all corners of society. And there's very often totally inadequate efforts at bringing the people that already distrust the government on board with it all. So, I mean, this is something where we don't have a great deal of influence on. Ultimately, this is again down to national level elites in the member countries, because these tend to be China's interlocutors. So China itself is often taking a very centralized approach to these negotiations. What we can do, however, in the long term is maybe also work with international bodies to convince them that establishing stronger standards, maybe at the level of regional organizations, like the EU, for example, already has them, and ASEAN might also have them in the future, could maybe also serve to push member governments into the directions of better governance standards for the BRI.
So we've been talking a little bit about the potential recommendation for the China as well as the recipient country. So in your opinion, what do you think that this country, what are the next steps for this country, namely the EU country? Do you think that they will continue to welcome the investment, or given like the very popular fear of the debt trap, like you said, it can be a misunderstanding, but it's quite a popular sentiment, right? But what do you think will be the next step of these countries regarding to the BRI?
So I don't see the BRI making much headway in Europe, but the reason for that is not so much any debt trap concerns, but it's mainly that the way in which BRI projects are being funded is not compatible with European standards. So under the EU regime, you are not allowed, for example, to simply design a project and then award that to a specific company and just find a funder for it. And that's the way the Chinese are doing things. Because under EU regulations, you have to have an open and competitive bidding process. And that's actually the reason why Chinese companies haven't actually made much headway outside of a couple EU not member countries, but countries that have applied to join the EU. So what I would, however, see, where I see an overlap in interests, is that the BRI could make, if the BRI is done well, let's put it that way, it could actually make a positive contribution to the stabilization of conflict-affected states, of which you also have a lot, not within Europe, but on Europe's periphery. So this, of course, became a very urgent issue, especially after the refugee crisis in 2015. Mm-hmm. And so I would believe if you maybe have an overlap of Chinese capital that is willing to enter these high-risk environments and European know-how that is willing to contribute on how you could turn that money into something that actually delivers for local people, then you could in the end result maybe have this win-win cooperation that China always likes to talk about. But of course, that also requires a lot of political will actually on both sides. So on the Chinese side, unfortunately, there's not a great deal of interest so far to open up the BRI and to welcome this kind of cooperation by especially Western actors. And among Western countries, again, there's always this suspicion that the BRI is ultimately a geopolitical plot designed to further Chinese influence, and that also severely limits the kind of input that I think would be palatable to our own Western governments.
That is true. I'd like to remind the participant that we are open for questions during the show. So you can feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. And we apologize again for not being able to live stream on Facebook. We understand that it is the most optimized platform, but thank you for still looking for us and joining us in this Zoom link. So at the moment, I guess that some of the participants have already looked at some of your recent publication, but in case that they haven't got a chance to read the whole thing through, can you share with us some of the key points from your recent works? Namely from the report, a very comprehensive report called Road to Peace or Bone of Tension, the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative on conflict states.
Mm-hmm. So that is something which we published this spring and which basically covers our research on 4 case studies. That's Pakistan, Myanmar, Kyrgyzstan, and Uganda. So 4 cases spread out across 4 world regions. So that, of course, since we had to combine all of them into one report, it means that we couldn't go into full detail on all of them. But what we kind of tried was to figure out how BRI investments interacted with existing conflict lines on the ground. So the important thing here is not that we assume, these were stable countries and then the BRI came along and they turned into conflict societies. No, they were already severely conflict afflicted, and the BRI may have made some things worse in the sense that they especially reheated distribution conflicts. So that BRI investments would be unevenly distributed within the country, and some groups thought that others benefited more than them. And this, as again in the case of Pakistan, is something that triggered violent resistance. There's also something which we try to investigate, and maybe if there are also some positive aspects. And again, we have to see that the Belt and Road Initiative is often the most realistic option which a lot of those countries have to actually pursue national development plans. So, for example, in Pakistan, you've made enormous progress on electricity provision. The country was usually plagued by very frequent black and brownouts, and nowadays that is fortunately a thing of the past. So the electricity situation has greatly improved. There's also now a second phase that's underway where the construction of industrial zones is being put at the front and center. And what that basically means is that Pakistan is trying to retrace the Chinese development model, what China already did begin in the 1970s. And I think it's going to be a very, very interesting case study if that can actually work in a different country. So again, the report, if you want to read it, that's our very preliminary conclusions. And we have plans to reinvestigate at least some of those cases again through proper field research beginning next year.
Sorry. So I also see that you have another very recent publication last May with Mona Lisa Adhikari. So this one is on the case of China in Myanmar. Any particular thing that you would like to share with us within this case?
Well, that one wasn't written not so much about the BRI, but mostly about the Chinese reaction to the coup in Myanmar. So following the coup, you had this immediate reaction in Western media that the coup is a good thing for China, because there's kind of this automatic assumption that Western countries are trying to spread democracy globally. And since China is an autocracy, China is somehow happy about countries turning authoritarian instead. And we try to counter that by pointing out that China had actually enjoyed very strong ties with the previous civilian government led by Aung San Suu Kyi. And specifically looking at the BRI, that's maybe the one angle which we had in there. We believe that this government was actually the only one that could have succeeded in selling the BRI in Myanmar. We believe that the current junta government is not going to be capable of that. And you have already seen that Chinese investments in the country have gotten caught up in the violence that followed the coup, that there were a lot of suspicions that China is an ally of the new military government, and that therefore protesters have also turned against Chinese factories, as well as some of the Chinese cross-country projects. And at the same time, you have this kind of strange situation that China potentially has a lot of leverage over Myanmar because it's probably going to be the only country that's going to be funding investments going forward, following the withdrawal of most Western countries, of course. But the interesting thing is that China cannot do a great deal with this influence. So China is kind of where the impression, at least, caught between two sides that are now engaged in conflict again with each other. And it is finding it very, very hard to actually trace a way that is simultaneously achieving stability in the country, which is like the number one target that it wants for its economic investments, and trying to find a partner for that that actually has the trust of local people, which again is definitely not the case with the military government, and where they would have been, I think, much, much better served with a continued government by the National League for Democracy. And we think that this is, going to be a dilemma which China is going to be facing in a lot of other countries going forward. And where we also think that this previous strong emphasis on non-interference in foreign policy is probably going to get hollowed out more and more.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and as much as I love to extend the discussion, but unfortunately, it seems like we're reaching the end of the show. So, in a very brief answer, we have some DIV students here, and we have also a question from the student, which is, what are the motivation of China to implement the BRI in country with conflicts? So, can you give a brief answer on that?
I think there the BRI is following a pattern which we've already had in other Chinese investments. So China is an industrial latecomer. At the time when China industrialized and really its companies began to go out into the rest of the world, A lot of the most interesting, let's say, investment opportunities had already been snapped up by other international actors. So when China was designing the BRI and focusing on its competitive strength in building infrastructure, it also had to look at, where is there a niche for us to go into? And you don't have that, for example, in highly developed countries where there's already a very high level of infrastructure. You also don't have it in developing countries that have easy access to international capital. And then conflict societies kind of end up by default as the category where it's the easiest to make inroads. At least if you're like China, you have a very high level of risk acceptance. So if you're willing to ignore or accept these conflict risks, then this is simply where you have the biggest niche that has not already been closed by other actors.
That is true. Okay, thank you. So in a very brief duration, only 30 minutes, Dr. Pascal Abb has been able to give us a closer look on China's investment within the BRI framework. And this has been surely a very popular topic among scholars and politicians. And I'm sure that there's still the field for the research as well. But I'm glad that we've had a very fruitful discussion today. So thank you, Dr. Pascal Abb, again for your valuable insights. And to the audience, I hope that you will turn in for our weekly talk show on Facebook next week. Hopefully that we will be able to get past the technical difficulties and